think you know what life was like for early American colonists? Log cabins, turkey dinners, and friendly encounters with natives, right? Well, Hollywood's been lying for decades. The reality of colonial life was so brutal and unforgiving that it makes our worst camping trip look like a luxury vacation. Picture this. You've just stepped off a cramped, disease-ridden ship after months at sea. The year is 1607, and you're about to discover that survival isn't just challenging. It's a daily battle against starvation, disease, and elements determined to kill you. Most colonists didn't make it through their first winter. During Jamestown's infamous starving time of 1609 to 1610, the population dropped from 500 to just 60 survivors, an 88% mortality rate. These weren't just statistics, they were real people who thought they were heading toward opportunity and instead found themselves in a living nightmare. Before we dive deeper into this harsh reality, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started with revelations that'll change how you see our nation's founding. Let's start with the journey itself. A part of the story most history books gloss over. These weren't cruise ships. We're talking about wooden vessels roughly 100 feet long, packed with 100 to 200 desperate souls. The smell alone would probably knock you unconscious. Imagine being trapped in a space smaller than a modern school bus for months, with no proper sanitation, limited fresh water, and rotting food. One Mayflower passenger described the stench as worse than any stable or pigsty. Disease spread like wildfire. Scurvy made teeth fall out and gums bleed. Dysentery turned the lower decks into a nightmare of human waste. Typhus, spread by lice, could kill you within weeks. Ship manifests from the Virginia Company show that typically 10 to 15% of passengers died during the crossing itself, before they even saw the New World. But the most terrifying aspect was the storms. These ships would be tossed around like toys in the Atlantic's notorious weather. Passengers were thrown against walls, and waves crashed through any opening. One survivor wrote that during a violent storm, we thought surely God had abandoned us to the depths. The food situation was equally grim. Ships carried hardtack, biscuits so tough they could break your teeth, often infested with weevils. Water, stored in wooden barrels, would turn green and slimy within weeks. Many passengers survived on just a few ounces of rancid water and moldy bread daily. When food ran out, some resorted to eating leather, rats, and in desperate cases, the bodies of those who had already died. When land was finally spotted, you'd think the worst was over. You'd be wrong. The America that greeted these colonists bore no resemblance to the fertile, welcoming land they'd been promised. Instead, they found dense forests, swamps filled with disease-carrying mosquitoes, and winters that could freeze them solid. Take Jamestown. The Virginia Company had promised a land flowing with gold. What the colonists found was a marshy peninsula surrounded by brackish water that bred malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The water was contaminated with salt, making it barely drinkable and unsuitable for cooking. Archaeological evidence from Jamestown shows that colonists were drinking water with salt levels high enough to cause kidney failure. Forget the cozy log cabins from movies. Most early colonists lived in glorified holes in the ground. These pit houses were dugouts covered with whatever they could scavenge: bark, animal skins, or rough-hewn planks. Excavations at Plymouth show these shelters were typically 10 by 12 feet, housing entire families. The floors were dirt, the walls leaked, and there was no insulation. During winter, temperatures inside often dropped below freezing. The lack of proper tools made everything exponentially harder. Most colonists were craftsmen, merchants, or gentlemen who had never swung an axe. Their European tools broke quickly against the iron-hard American oak. Food was scarce from day one. Colonists expected to trade with Native Americans, but relationships were often hostile. They also had no experience hunting or fishing in this new environment. A typical day for these early colonists was nothing like the romanticized version we imagine. Your day started before sunrise because you were probably too cold, hungry, or sick to sleep. The first priority was always fire. Starting one in the damp American climate with wet wood and primitive tools was a skill that took months to master. Many died simply because they couldn't maintain a fire during cold snaps. Water collection was the next challenge. Even if a source was found, it had to be made safe to drink, a judgment most colonists were ill-equipped to make. They'd often choose water that looked clear, but was contaminated with bacteria, causing deadly dysentery. Food preparation was a constant source of anxiety. Your daily ration might be a handful of corn and a small piece of salted meat that was probably spoiling. The work itself was backbreaking. Men, women, and children all labored from dawn to dusk just to maintain their precarious existence. They had to clear land by hand, build shelters, dig wells, and tend crops. Women faced additional hardships. Pregnancy and childbirth were essentially death sentences for many due to a lack of medical care, sanitation, and nutrition. Records from early Plymouth show that nearly 40% of women died in childbirth. Those who survived often watched their children die from diseases that are easily treatable today. Children who survived infancy were put to work as soon as they could walk, doing adult labor by age 10. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical hardships. Imagine being constantly hungry, cold, and afraid, surrounded by the graves of friends and family. Many colonists wrote about the crushing loneliness and despair that came with being thousands of miles from home, with no way to communicate with loved ones. If the harsh conditions didn't kill you, disease almost certainly would. Colonial America was a breeding ground for illnesses that could wipe out entire settlements in weeks. The combination of poor sanitation, malnutrition, overcrowding, and exposure to new pathogens created perfect conditions for epidemics. Smallpox was the most feared killer, spreading rapidly and often killing up to 30% of those it infected. Native American populations had no immunity, leading to mortality rates of 90% or higher in some tribes. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes in the swampy areas, caused recurring fevers. In Jamestown, it was considered unusual for someone not to have it. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water, was another major killer. And colonial records are filled with accounts of the bloody flux wiping out entire families. Childhood diseases that we barely think about today, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, were death sentences. Records from Plymouth show that in some years, more than half of all children born died before their 5th birthday. The colonists had virtually no medical knowledge by modern standards. Their treatments, like bloodletting for fever or mercury for various ailments, often made things worse. Early colonial America wasn't a land of freedom and rights, but rather a strict, authoritarian society where survival trumped individual rights. Punishment was swift and public, designed to serve as a deterrent. Theft of food could result in having your ears cut off or being branded with a hot iron. Repeat offenders might be hanged for relatively minor crimes. The stocks and pillory were an everyday reality. Colonists would be locked in these devices for hours or days for offenses as minor as gossiping, missing church, or unseemly walking with a woman. Religious conformity was mandatory. Missing services could result in fines, public punishment, or banishment, which was often a death sentence. The concept of individual privacy didn't exist. Your neighbors were literally watching to make sure you weren't hoarding food or shirking work duties. Women couldn't own property, vote, or make legal decisions without their husband's permission. Unmarried women were viewed with suspicion and sometimes accused of witchcraft. Children had virtually no rights and were often bound out as servants to other families, a system often little better than slavery. The death penalty was used far more frequently than most people realize for crimes like adultery, blasphemy, and even persistent disobedience to parents. No aspect of colonial history has been more romanticized than the relationship between colonists and Native Americans. The story we tell ourselves about the first Thanksgiving, friendly natives sharing a feast with grateful pilgrims, bears almost no resemblance to the complex, often violent reality. The truth is that most early encounters were characterized by mutual suspicion and escalating violence. The famous First Thanksgiving of 1621 was likely more of a tense diplomatic meeting than a celebration. The Wampanoag leader Massasoit attended as a calculated political move, not out of friendship. This brief cooperation was an exception. Within a generation, the same communities were engaged in brutal warfare. King Philip's War saw colonists and natives engaging in war crimes like burning villages with civilians inside. Colonists often used trade relationships to create dependencies on European goods, then exploited them. Disease played a devastating role. European diseases had already wiped out an estimated 90% of the Native American population in New England before the Pilgrims even arrived. Entire villages stood empty. The colonists often interpreted these empty lands as divine providence, God clearing the way for their settlements, conveniently ignoring the human tragedy. The language barrier created constant opportunities for misunderstanding, leading to cycles of violence that escalated over decades. Colonial winters were literally life or death situations. The combination of inadequate shelter, insufficient food, and brutal weather created what colonists called the starving time. periods when communities would lose 30 to 50% of their population in a single season. The winter of 1609 to 1610 in Jamestown remains one of the most horrific examples, with evidence of cannibalism. Plymouth's first winter wasn't much better. The Mayflower passengers arrived far too late to plant crops or build adequate shelter. By spring, half of the 102 passengers were dead. The cold itself was unlike anything most Europeans had experienced. Many froze to death in their own beds. Food preservation was a constant challenge. Stored supplies would freeze and then rot. The psychological impact of these brutal winters was devastating. Colonists watched friends and family slowly waste away from starvation and cold, powerless to help. The constant sound of coughing from scurvy and other diseases filled their cramped shelters. Firewood became more valuable than gold. Scurvy caused teeth to fall out, gums to bleed, and old wounds to reopen. The economic system that brought colonists to America was far from the opportunity for prosperity many had been promised. Most arrived as indentured servants, bound by contracts that essentially made them slaves for 4 to 7 years. They worked 12 to 16 hours per day with minimal food and shelter. Many died before completing their terms, and those who survived had no resources to start independent lives. Even free colonists often found themselves trapped in cycles of debt. They were charged for their passage, tools, food, and shelter, with the expectation that they would pay it back. The harsh conditions made it nearly impossible to produce enough to pay off these debts. The promised land grants often turned out to be worthless, located in areas controlled by hostile natives or in swamps impossible to farm. The few who made it typically did so through land speculation, slave trading, or exploiting the labor of indentured servants. The rugged individualism we associate with colonial America was largely a later invention. Most successful settlements depended heavily on support from Europe. The real story of early American colonists isn't one of brave pioneers conquering a new world. It's a story of desperate people making impossible choices in conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. The high mortality rates tell the story more clearly than any romanticized account ever could. For every colonial success story we celebrate, there were dozens of settlements that simply vanished. The colonists who survived often did so by adapting to a level of brutality that would shock modern sensibilities. They learned to accept death as a daily possibility and to make decisions based purely on survival rather than morality. The America that emerged from this crucible of suffering was shaped by these experiences in ways we're still grappling with today. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the achievement of building a nation from nothing. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. But it does force us to confront the real cost of that achievement, paid not just by the colonists themselves, but by the Native Americans whose lands were taken and the Africans who were enslaved. The next time you see a movie about colonial America, remember that the real story was far more complex, brutal, and human than any Hollywood version could capture. They weren't superhuman pioneers, they were people like us, trying to make the best of an impossible situation and paying a price for survival that most of us can barely imagine. The untold stories of American history are far more fascinating and complex than the myths we've been taught. If you want to explore more of these hidden truths that shaped our nation, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, because the real story of America is just beginning to be told. And let us know in the comments, what other colonial myths would you like us to investigate? The truth is always more interesting than the legend.